You've probably heard this statement: America was not founded as a Christian nation. Usually it's said with tremendous confidence. Sometimes they'll add, the founding fathers were mostly deists, or the Constitution never mentions Jesus. Or they'll pull out the Treaty of Tripoli and say, case closed. The founders themselves said America wasn't founded on Christianity. Okay, then I have a question. If America wasn't founded within a Christian civilization, why did early American states write constitutions that explicitly talked about Christianity? And why did some of them go even further and specifically talk about Protestant Christianity? Why did Massachusetts, for example, provide for public Protestant teachers of piety, religion, and morality? Why did South Carolina's Constitution actually declare the Christian Protestant religion shall be the established religion of the state? Why did Maryland's Declaration of Rights explicitly protect people professing the Christian religion? And here's the one that surprised me when I started digging into this. There were 56 men who signed the Declaration of Independence. Only one was Roman Catholic, Charles Carroll of Maryland. The other 55 came from the Protestant world. Now, does that automatically mean all 55 were born again, Orthodox Christians? No. And I'm not going to cook the books to make the argument easier, because I don't have to. In fact, I think something much more interesting happened. America created a federal government that did not establish a national denomination inside a civilization that was unmistakably shaped by Christianity and overwhelmingly shaped by Protestant Christianity. Those are not contradictory statements. And once you understand that distinction, a whole lot of what we've been told about America's founding starts looking different.
Done and done.
So today we're going to put the slogans away. We're going to look at the documents. We're going to look at the founders. We're going to look at the original 13 states or colonies. States, actually, in this case. We're going to deal with Jefferson, Franklin, deism, the First Amendment, the Treaty of Tripoli. And we're going to ask the question nobody seems to want to ask. What did the word religion mean to the people who actually founded the country? Because if we're going to make a historical claim, let's make one we can actually prove. Okay, part one. What do we mean by Christian nation? This is where both sides often start talking past each other. If by Christian nation you mean, did the Constitution create something equivalent to the Church of England? No. Did it establish the Presbyterian Church as America's official national church? No. Did the Constitution require the president to be a Christian? No. Article 6 actually says no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. That's in the Constitution. We don't need to hide it. And later, the First Amendment said, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Notice the language. Congress, the federal government. And this matters enormously because the United States was originally a federation of states possessing enormous authority of their own. The federal government had enumerated powers. The states retained broad police powers. And religion was largely considered a state matter. The Library of Congress specifically explains that one reason the federal Constitution says relatively little about religion is that many delegates believed authority concerning religion belonged primarily to the states rather than the federal government. That changes the question. If you want to know the religious assumptions of early America, don't just look at the federal Constitution, look at the states that created the federal government. And when you do, things get very interesting. All right, let's look at the states. Let's start opening some documents, not memes, not political speeches, documents. Massachusetts. The Massachusetts Constitution of 1780 was principally drafted by John Adams. And listen to Article 3. It says that, quote, the happiness of a people and the good order and preservation of civil government essentially depend upon piety, religion, and morality. But keep going, because Massachusetts authorized support for public Protestant teachers of piety, religion, and morality, not secular ethics professors, not generic spirituality, Protestant teachers. That language is preserved by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts itself. To this day, John Adams is constantly brought forward as evidence that the founders weren't Christian in any meaningful sense, yet Adams helped produce a constitution that explicitly connected the Republican government with religion and supported Protestant religious instruction. Whatever complexities existed in Adam's personal theology, the political culture in which he operated was not secular in the modern sense, not even close. Let's move on to South Carolina. Its 1778 Constitution is even harder to explain away. Article 38 declares, "The Christian Protestant religion shall be deemed and is hereby constituted and declared to be the established religion of this state." Read that again. The Christian Protestant religion, not merely religion, not generic theism, not deism, Protestant Christianity. Protestant denominations would enjoy equal religious and civil privileges. Now, imagine somebody standing in South Carolina in 1778 saying, actually, religion had almost nothing to do with the American political order. Somebody would have handed him a copy of the state constitution. New Jersey. The 1776 New Jersey Constitution prohibited establishing one particular religious sect over another. Interesting. Religious liberty. But then Article 19 says the people professing the faith of a Protestant sect could hold public office and enjoy the corresponding privileges. Again, Protestant. The New Jersey State Archives preserves this Constitution to this day. So notice what we're discovering here. Religious liberty and Protestant political culture were not considered mutually exclusive. That's important. Modern Americans sometimes imagine only two options. Option one, government establishes a church and persecutes everybody else. Option two, government must pretend religion has nothing whatsoever to do with public life. Well, the founding generation often operated with a third option, religious liberty, inside an overwhelmingly Christian moral culture. Maryland. Maryland is especially fascinating because Maryland had a significant Catholic history. Its 1776 Declaration of Rights said all persons professing the Christian religion are equally entitled to protection in their religious liberty. It even permitted the legislature, at least constitutionally, to levy a general tax supporting the Christian religion while allowing individuals their contributions. Again, that's not 21st century secularism. Next, let's talk about the Protestant character of colonial America. Because the state constitutions didn't fall out of the sky. America's religious culture had been developing for more than a century. Puritans, Congregationalists, Anglicans, Presbyterians, Baptists, Quakers, Dutch Reformed, which is my grandfather, German Reformed, Lutherans. These groups disagreed about plenty, sometimes bitterly, sometimes violently. But notice something. They overwhelmingly were Protestant. The Library of Congress describes many of America's original settlers as people of deep religious convictions who crossed the Atlantic partly to practice their faith. It also notes that the Great Awakening injected new religious vigor into 18th century America before the Revolution. And that Great Awakening matters. George Whitefield wasn't holding seminars on French Enlightenment nationalism. He was preaching the gospel. Jonathan Edwards wasn't telling colonial America, human beings are basically fine. Just follow your heart. Quite the opposite. The Great Awakening created a religious vocabulary that crossed colonial boundaries. People who thought of themselves primarily as Virginians, Pennsylvanians, or New Englanders were participating in something much bigger than themselves, a shared Protestant religious culture.
Awake, O sleeper, and hear the truth!
And then something fascinating happens. That Protestant culture begins intersecting with political ideas about liberty, covenant, conscience, moral responsibility, human depravity, limited government, resistance to tyranny. Now, be careful here. I'm not saying every idea in the Constitution came directly from a Bible verse. That's sloppy history. And once again, we don't need it. Founders also inherited English common law. Locke, Montesquieu, the Enlightenment, Greek and Roman political thought. America has multiple intellectual tributaries, but one of the biggest rivers feeding the whole thing was Christianity, and more specifically, Protestant Christianity. It's just the truth, whether you're interested in that or not. What about those 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence? Here's where we need to clean up a statistic that's often thrown around. You may have heard Charlie Kirk and others make the point that virtually all the Declaration signers were Christian. Here's what we can establish beyond serious debate. There were 56 signers. Charles Carroll of Penn was the only Roman Catholic signer. The National Archives confirms that explicitly. That means the remaining signers came out of America's overwhelmingly Protestant world. You'll find Anglicans in there, Congregationalists, Presbyterians, Quakers, Episcopalians, and others. But here's where Christians sometimes hurt their own case. Church affiliation does not automatically prove personal regeneration. Being baptized Anglican doesn't tell me exactly what somebody believed about the resurrection. So don't say more than the evidence gives you, because we don't need to. The astonishing historical fact remains. 55 of the 56 Declaration signers were not Roman Catholic and were associated by background or affiliation with the Protestant world. One Catholic, Charles Carroll. And Carroll himself was hardly secular. Late in life, after enormous wealth and public acclaim, Carroll wrote the importance of practicing the duties of his religion. So when somebody presents the Declaration as the product of a basically secular group of Enlightenment skeptics, that picture is badly distorted at best. Next, but most of the founders were deists, Pastor Rob. Haven't you heard that? Sure, I've heard it. Now we reach what possibly is the most common argument. The founding fathers are these creatures called deists. Okay, first question, which founders? That's not sarcasm. It's an actual historical problem. When somebody says the founding fathers, who exactly are we counting here? The 56 Declaration signers? The delegates to the Constitutional Convention? The members of the Continental Congress? Washington's generals? Early governors? The people who ratified the Constitution? The authors of state constitutions? Early Supreme Court justices? Because sometimes the founders mysteriously shrinks to about 5 guys. Jefferson, Franklin, Madison, Washington, Adams. Which is an interesting selection. America was founded by hundreds of political leaders, clergy, lawyers, soldiers, and citizens. Historian Mark David Hall spent years challenging the claim that America's founders were predominantly deists. And here's the basic problem. Actual deism is a fairly specific theological position. A deistic God creates the universe, but does not ordinarily intervene supernaturally in human affairs. Miracles become problematic, special revelation becomes problematic, providence becomes problematic. The deity becomes something like a cosmic architect who builds the clock, winds it up, and walks away. Now, read the founding generation. They can't stop talking about providence. That creates a problem for the whole deist thing. Next, George Washington and providence. George Washington wasn't a systematic theologian, and people have debated his precise theological standing for generations. Fine. But calling Washington a simple deist creates immediate problems. Washington repeatedly spoke about providence governing events. He called Americans to Thanksgiving. He spoke of divine favor. And as president, he issued the famous 1789 Thanksgiving Proclamation, recommending that Americans acknowledge the providence of Almighty God. That's not the language you'd expect from a strict deist. A God who potentially governs nations is doing something. He's not sitting outside the universe checking his watch. And Washington wasn't alone. What about Benjamin Franklin, the deist who asked for prayer? Oh, you didn't know that? If you want a founder who genuinely entertained deistic ideas, Franklin is one of your strongest candidates. I'll give you that. So let's not dodge him. We don't need to. Young Franklin explicitly described himself as a deist. There you go. But Franklin's beliefs changed and developed. And then something happened during the Constitutional Convention that should make us hesitate before putting Franklin squarely in the deist camp, the old God doesn't intervene ever box. The convention was struggling, delegates were divided, the whole project looked endangered, and the elderly Benjamin Franklin stood up and reminded the delegates that during the revolution they had prayed for divine protection. And he asked, have we forgotten that powerful friend? And Franklin proposed that prayers seeking divine assistance be held during the convention. Think about that. What kind of deist asked God to intervene in the Constitutional Convention? If God doesn't intervene, why pray? Franklin certainly wasn't an orthodox evangelical Christian. He expressed serious doubts about doctrines Christians consider essential and orthodox. But that's precisely the point. The options aren't Orthodox Baptist or atheistic secularist. The religious landscape was far more complicated. Franklin may have been heterodox. He may have retained deistic, tendencies, but he nevertheless believed strongly enough in divine providence to call political leaders to prayer. That doesn't fit the memes. What about Thomas Jefferson? Let's deal with this. He's the hardest case, right? Well, if you're trying to prove every major founder was an Orthodox Christian, Thomas Jefferson will ruin that afternoon for you. Jefferson rejected major elements of historical Christian orthodoxy. He famously produced the edited presentation of Jesus' teachings, excluding all the miracles. In fact, he cut them out of the Bible. So I'm not putting Jefferson on the membership roll of First Baptist Church, but here's the fascinating part. Even Jefferson did not believe religious faith was irrelevant to American civilization. Look at the Declaration itself. Jefferson's draft, modified by Congress, appeals to nature's God, a creator who endows human beings with rights, a supreme judge of the world, and divine providence. 4 theological references. Now, someone will say, those aren't specifically Christian. Correct. Not explicitly, that's important, but they're also not atheistic. And the Declaration isn't a theological textbook. It's a political declaration addressed partly to an international audience. The important question is, where did the founding generation believe rights ultimately came from? Government? No. The king? No, they did a whole revolution against that thought. Parliament? Nope. Human consensus? No. The Declaration says human beings are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. That's an enormous statement. Government doesn't manufacture your rights, therefore, government doesn't possess ultimate authority to take them away. Rights precede government because rights originate beyond government. That's one of the most revolutionary sentences ever put on paper. Here's another man that people want to shove into a simple theological box, but Adams held beliefs that differed significantly from Orthodox Trinitarian Christianity. That's true. But remember what we already saw. Adams was the principal architect of the Massachusetts Constitution, and that Constitution said Republican government depended upon piety, religion, morality, and it provided for Protestant religious instruction. That's the distinction you have to understand. The question isn't merely, could I get John Adams to sign my church's doctrinal statement? The historical question is, what moral and religious framework did Adams assume was necessary for a free republic? And the answer certainly wasn't religion should disappear from public life. No way. The Continental Congress. Now, this may be one of the most devastating evidence against the idea that America's founding government was hostile or indifferent toward Christianity. The Library of Congress says the Continental and Confederation Congress contained an extraordinary number of deeply religious men, quote, and it says Congress invested more energy encouraging religious practice than any later national government. Think about that. The same generation we're told wanted religion banished from public life was publicly encouraging religion. Congress issued calls for prayer, fasting, thanksgiving. They employed chaplains. Public officials invoked God. This wasn't some embarrassing accident that slipped past the founders. These were the founders. What about this phrase tossed around today, separation of church and state? What does that actually mean? Well, it's definitely one of the most misunderstood phrases in American history. First observation we need to make, those words do not appear in the Constitution, separation of church and state. They come from Thomas Jefferson's 1802 letter to the Dunbury Baptist, where he described the First Amendment as building a wall of separation between church and state. But why were Baptists concerned? Because religious minorities had firsthand experience with established churches. The fear was not primarily someone might mention Jesus in public. The fear was governmental control and establishment of religion, like England did and still does. That's a completely different problem. Remember the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. There are two protections, no establishment and free exercise. Government can't create a national church. Government also can't prohibit religious practice. The founders weren't necessarily trying to protect the government from Christians. They were trying to prevent government from controlling religion and prevent one denomination from using federal power against another denomination. And in a country filled with, like I said, Anglicans, Congregationalists, Presbyterians, Baptists, Quakers, Lutherans, Reformed Christians, Catholics, and eventually Jews and others, that was brilliant to do this, because which church would you establish? Anglican? Tell that to the Massachusetts Tell that to the Virginia Presbyterian. The Baptists might have something to say about that too. Religious liberty helped make America's enormous religious diversity possible. And ironically, it helped Christianity flourish. Now let's deal with the sentence that supposedly ends the entire debate. The Treaty of Tripoli, 1797. Article 11 in the English version famously says, "The government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion," close quote. There it is. So pack it up, video over, except maybe not. First, notice that it actually says the government of the United States. That is precisely the distinction we've been making. The federal government was not founded as an ecclesiastical Christian institution. America wasn't launching a, Christian version of an Islamic state. And why was the statement appearing in a treaty with Tripoli? Context matters. The United States was negotiating with a Muslim power in North Africa. The diplomatic point was that America wasn't engaged in a religious war against Islam. The sentence continues by explaining that the United States has no hostility toward the religion or tranquility of Muslims. Is that an oxymoron? It might be. Think about it. But in other words, we're not fighting you because you're Muslims, they were saying. This isn't a crusade. That's very different from saying Christianity had nothing to do with the American civilization. And here's another fascinating complication. The Arabic text associated with the treaty does not straightforwardly correspond to Article 11 in the English translation. Weird. So yes, use the Treaty of Tripoli. Don't hide from it on the screen. You can go look it up on the internet. But correctly understood, it demonstrates something we should happily affirm. The United States federal government was not created as a church. That's not the same proposition as saying America wasn't profoundly Christian in culture, institutions, morality, and political assumptions. Next, religious liberty is not secularism. This is where I think the modern debate goes completely sideways. Religious liberty is sometimes treated as though it proves the founders wanted a secular society. Why? Those are different ideas. A Christian can believe coercing somebody into Christianity is wrong. A Protestant can believe the government shouldn't select which Protestant denomination is correct. A Baptist can oppose an established Anglican church precisely because he's serious about Christianity, and that happened. Some of America's strongest advocates of religious liberty were deeply religious people, but they weren't saying Christianity doesn't matter. They were saying Caesar doesn't get to dictate your conscience. That's different, very different. Next, why this whole focus on Protestantism matters. Now we're ready for the part of this conversation that often gets skipped over. Why say America's founding culture was specifically Protestant? Doesn't that put unnecessary tension between Protestants and Catholics? Well, I say it because historically it was a fact. Look at the denominations, the colonial establishments. Look at the Great Awakening, at the universities, at the clergy, at the political sermons, at the state constitutions. Massachusetts explicitly referred to Protestant teachers. New Jersey explicitly protected Protestant office holders. South Carolina explicitly established the Christian Protestant religion. Charles Carroll was the lone Catholic, as I said earlier, signing the Declaration of Independence. Even the prejudices of colonial America demonstrate how overwhelmingly Protestant the culture was. Catholics frequently faced serious civil restrictions, and let's be clear, I'm not celebrating that. Religious persecution is not something Christians should defend. I'm making a historical observation. You cannot simultaneously admit that Catholics suffered discrimination in colonial America and then pretend colonial America wasn't overwhelmingly Protestant. The discrimination itself proves which religious culture held political dominance. But did Protestantism actually influence the political ideas? Well, absolutely. And this is deeper than, counting church memberships. One of Protestantism's central ideas was that ordinary people should have access to Scripture. That requires literacy. So Protestant cultures developed enormous emphasis on reading and education. And there's covenant theology. Puritan political thinking frequently understood communities covenantally. People bound themselves together under obligations before God. And there's human nature. Biblical Christianity does not teach that human beings are naturally perfect or even good. Power, therefore, can't simply be trusted. James Madison famously wrote in Federalist 51, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary." Now, Madison isn't quoting Romans 3, but the anthropology should sound familiar to anybody who owns a Bible. Human beings are capable of evil. Therefore, power must check power. Ambition counteracts ambition. Authority is divided. Not because humans are angels. Christian theology wasn't the only source of checks and balances. Again, don't overclaim. The Christian doctrine of fallen human nature fit extremely comfortably with a political system suspicious of concentrated power. Frank Turek has frequently made this broader apologetic point. The American system assumes human beings possess inherent dignity while simultaneously recognizing that humans cannot safely be trusted with unlimited power. Those two ideas fit Christianity remarkably well. Made in God's image and fallen, dignity and depravity. That's a pretty good recipe for constitutional government. Now, where did these human rights we fight so diligently for, where did they come from? Now, consider the Declaration's central claim. All men are created equal. Created. Not evolved politically into equality, not declared equal because Parliament voted 51% to 49%. Created equal. Created equal. Why? Because their equality exists before government does. This is where thinkers such as William Lane Craig become very useful. Not as historians of the American founding, but as philosophers. Craig has spent decades arguing that if objective moral values and duties exist, their ultimate foundation requires something beyond changing human opinion. Apply that philosophical question here. If rights are granted by government, government can't revoke them. If rights are agreements, another culture can disagree. But if rights belong to human beings because of what human beings are, then government answers to a moral standard above itself. The Declaration places that standard ultimately in the Creator. That's the genius of it. King George isn't God. Congress isn't God. The Supreme Court isn't God. The majority isn't God. Government exists underneath a moral law it did not create. That's profoundly important. Outstanding theologian and pastor Erwin Lutzer and friend has often emphasized the difference between America's Christian heritage and the idea that every American was actually a Christian. And that's a distinction worth preserving. He says a nation cannot be born again. People are born again. Jesus doesn't save countries, Jesus saves sinners. So when I call America historically a Christian nation, I'm not saying, and this is Lutzer talking, America has a covenant with God identical to Israel. It doesn't. I'm not saying America is God's chosen nation. I'm not saying American patriotism equals Christianity. It doesn't. The cross does not need the American flag to hold it up. It's the other way around. What we're saying historically is that the civilization that produced the American founding operated largely inside a Christian worldview, and specifically inside an overwhelmingly Protestant culture. That's history, not theology. And confusing these categories causes trouble in both directions. What about the argument from silence, Pastor Rob? The Constitution doesn't mention Jesus. Correct. And the Articles of Confederation barely discuss religion either. Yet the Congress operating under them openly encourage religious observation. The Constitution is a document defining the structure and powers of a federal government. It tells us how presidents are elected, how senators serve, what courts do, how legislation works, how powers are divided. It's not the Westminster Confession, and nobody expected it to be. In fact, the Library of Congress notes that some devout Americans at the time actually complained that the Constitution didn't sufficiently acknowledge God. Think about what that tells you. There was a debate. There were Americans who wanted stronger religious language. Others thought religion belonged primarily within state jurisdiction. The resulting federal constitution avoided establishing a national religion, but you cannot take the absence of an establishment and magically turn that into establishment of secularism. That's sleight of hand. Now here's another historical fact many Americans don't know. When the First Amendment was ratified, some states still maintained forms of religious establishment or religious preference. Think about that. The same generation that ratified "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion" lived under state governments that maintained religious arrangements. But how does that work? Because the First Amendment originally restricted Congress. That's what it says. The modern application of the Establishment Clause against state governments developed much later through 14th Amendment incorporation. Whatever you think of later constitutional doctrine, historically, this matters enormously. It tells us how the founding generation understood the original constitutional structure. No national church, religious test, religious liberty. Yet, states could and did maintain significant religious provisions. That's not modern secularism. Let's finally answer it. Some founders were unquestionably influenced by this thing called deism. Some held heterodox Christian beliefs. Some were difficult to classify. Some were unquestionably Orthodox Christians. But the claim most of the founders were deists is way too simplistic and far from the truth. If someone makes that claim, ask them, define deist, then name the founders, then demonstrate that each one actually fits the definition. Can you do that? The slogan becomes much harder to sustain. Historian Mark David Hall argues that the popular picture of a predominantly deistic founding generally badly exaggerates the evidence. And even some historians who reject the label Christian founding acknowledge that the founders occupied a much broader religious spectrum than the simplistic Christian versus deist binary suggests. Responsible position. Don't turn Jefferson into Billy Graham, but don't turn John Jay into Voltaire either. Let these people actually be who they were. Here's a useful thought experiment. Take an average political leader from 1776, put him in a time machine, bring him into 21st century America, then tell him it had nothing to do with public morality. I think his first response might be, who told you that? Remember what Massachusetts said? Piety, religion, morality were considered essential to good government. The Library of Congress summarizes the founding era view by saying most American statesmen shared their constituents' conviction that religion was indispensable to Republican institutions. That's huge. They weren't merely tolerating Christianity as some private hobby people practiced on Sunday morning. Religion was commonly viewed as helping produce the moral character necessary for self-government. Now, why is that? Well, because constitutional government requires restraint. If people cannot govern themselves internally, eventually somebody has to govern them externally. Liberty requires virtue, and the founding fathers repeatedly connected virtue with religion. All right, let's put all the pieces together. The colonies developed inside overwhelmingly Christian institutions. Most of these institutions were Protestant. The Great Awakening profoundly affected colonial culture. Protestant clergy participated in political debate. Early state constitutions were explicitly invoking Christianity. Some explicitly invoked Protestant Christianity, actually most. The Continental Congress publicly encouraged religious observation. The Declaration grounded human equality and rights in a creator. The founders repeatedly appealed to providence. The federal Constitution prohibited a national religious test. The First Amendment prohibited Congress from establishing religion and protecting its free exercise. These things aren't contradictions. Together, they paint a picture, the big picture. America was creating something unusual, a government without a national church inside an overwhelmingly Christian civilization. And I think that's the sentence we need to recover. So, was America not only a Christian nation, but a Protestant nation, culturally, historically, institutionally, at its founding? The evidence I think I've shown is overwhelmingly yes. But constitutionally, Protestant at the federal level? No. And that distinction matters. South Carolina could explicitly establish Protestant Christianity. Massachusetts could support Protestant teachers. New Jersey could give Protestants particular political protections, but the federal Constitution deliberately did something different. No religious test. No federally established denomination. Why? Well, because a federation containing all these competing Protestant denominations, along with Catholics, Jews, and others, needed a federal government capable of protecting political unity without deciding theological disputes. And in hindsight, that may have been one of the smartest things the founders ever did. Here's the irony. The absence of a national church didn't destroy Christianity in America. Christianity exploded. The Library of Congress describes evangelicalism as the dominant religious force in the early republic, particularly between 1800 and the Civil War. The Second Great Awakening erupts, churches multiply, missionary societies develop, Bible societies expand, Christian colleges spread, most of which were seminaries. revival movements sweep communities, America became arguably more evangelical after the Constitution, not less. Religious liberty didn't suffocate Christianity, friends. The government's hand from Christianity's throat and forced churches to persuade rather than coerce. And Christianity flourished. Now, should we even care about this? Here's where I want to turn this thing around, because Christians can spend so much time proving America had a Christian heritage that we forget something. A Christian heritage cannot save America. George Washington cannot save us. The Declaration of Independence cannot save us. The Constitution cannot save us. And putting the Ten Commandments on a wall or inside schools cannot change one human heart. Only Jesus Christ can do that. So why does this history even matter? Because truth matters. And we shouldn't rewrite it to make secularists comfortable either. Just tell the truth. America's founders weren't all evangelical Christians. Tell the truth. Some prominent founders rejected essential Christian doctrines. Tell the truth. The federal Constitution did not establish Christianity. The truth. The First Amendment protected religious freedom. But then keep telling the truth. America emerged from an overwhelmingly Christian civilization. Its religious culture was overwhelmingly Protestant. Christianity influenced its understanding of morality, virtue, human nature, liberty and government. Early state constitutions openly acknowledged Christianity. Some openly privileged Protestantism. The Continental Congress openly encouraged religion. The Declaration appealed to God repeatedly. You don't get to delete half the evidence because it's inconvenient. So, how do we wrap this up? Was America founded as a Christian nation? If you mean, did the United States Constitution establish a Christian church? No, it didn't. If you mean, were all the founders Orthodox Christians? No. If you mean, was America founded within a civilization whose dominant religion, moral vocabulary, institutions, and political assumptions were overwhelmingly Christian? Then yes. The evidence for that is overwhelming. It's enormous. And if you ask the even more specific question, which is, was that Christian culture predominantly Protestant? The answer becomes even clearer. Look at the denominations, at the colonies, at the signers, at the state constitutions. Look at Massachusetts, New Jersey, South Carolina. Don't take my word for it. Read their constitutions. You can still get them online. Maybe the biggest problem with this whole debate, we've stopped reading what the people were arguing about. We trade memes. We repeat slogans. Christian nation, secular nation, Christian nationalism, Deists, separation of church and state. And meanwhile, the documents are sitting there waiting, and they're considerably more interesting than either side's bumper sticker. America's founders created a federal government without an established church, but they didn't create it in a religious vacuum. They created it inside one of the most intensely Protestant cultures in the Western world, really ever. And they built a system in which government was denied the power to dictate that faith, because faith and conscience were too important to surrender to government. They still are. Now, that's not hostility toward religion, that's religious liberty. And Christians need to understand one final thing. Our mission is not to get America back to 1776. Our mission is not to baptize the Constitution. Our mission was given almost 17 centuries before Thomas Jefferson picked up his pen. Jesus said, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations." America needs Christians who understand its history. But even more desperately, America needs Christians who understand their mission, the Great Commission found in Matthew 28. Because America may have inherited a Christian civilization, but nobody inherits Christianity. Every generation has to decide what it'll do with Jesus Christ, and that includes ours. Listen, if you found this helpful, send it to somebody who's heard the claim that America's founders were basically a bunch of secular deists. And don't just send them the video, send them the documents. Because once you actually read what these people wrote, the story gets very difficult to erase. I'm Pastor Rob. This is Veritas 832. Truth matters. I'll see you in the next video.